go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us on the last day of our NERSA lead on here with Region 5-6 in Canada. We appreciate everyone being here. The session is being recorded and you can access it from the Canadian NERSA YouTube page. Make sure to keep yourself on mute while the presenter is presenting unless asked. We encourage you to leave your video on, type messages in the chat, any questions, comments that you may have. And then I'll give it over to Mallory. This is Mallory Valentine, the Assistant Director of Student and Member Engagement, and she's going to talk a little bit about resumes.
Thanks, Logan. So as you mentioned, my name is Mallory. I am at the University of Iowa. I do want to preface this presentation by saying two things. One, this is taken from the University of West Florida. When I was in grad school, I had the opportunity to intern in career services. And so this is where this content is coming from. And then the second thing I want to say is I hope you have your resume open right now along with your cover letter, because my expectation is for you to take away tangible information that can make your resume and cover letter better. So I won't be offended if you're not paying attention to me. I would rather you look at your materials and work on them as we go through this. If you have questions at all, please put it in the chat. I will give plenty of opportunity to ask questions and do my best because there can be a lot when it comes to resumes and cover letters. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So introduction. First things first, there is no one right way to write a resume. You're going to hear from me, my opinion. You're going to hear from your supervisor, a completely different opinion. At the end of the day, I want you to be okay with the way you chose to lay out your resume, the content that you chose to put on there, the way you designed it. It's all a reflection of who you are and how you want to showcase yourself to other people. So again, keep that in mind with the information I tell you. I want you to ask yourself, does this add value to my resume? When you think about all the things that you've done over your career, and as you continue to grow as a professional, you're going to get a lot of experience. At some point, you're going to have to decide, does this add value to the position I'm applying for? And if not, then maybe keep it off of your resume for that job application. Still keep it in your toolbox to use for other jobs, but don't include everything you've ever done necessarily, because sometimes it may not add value anymore to the position you're applying for. You want to bring out the big guns, so the things that are going to make you stand apart from your competitors or your peers. You want to make yourself be very valuable to the employer, and there should be three absolutes. It should be error-free. So I know yesterday, Troy, if you attended Troy's presentation, he talked about spelling errors. That's true. It should be error-free. It should be truthful. So don't exaggerate, because that can come back to haunt you in an interview if I'm going to ask you a follow-up question about something you have on there. And absolutely do not use templates. That's my biggest pet peeve, I think. If you have used a template that Word provided, just take the content and start over on a blank piece of paper. And the reason for that is the formatting is often really out of whack. And so we recommend that you do not use templates. Okay, so fonts, real basic. 10 to 12 point font is what we recommend. Your name can be larger, but typically speaking, the actual font of your meat and potatoes within your resume should be 10 to 12 points. It should be Times Roman or Arial, generally speaking. I know Calibri is also being used more frequently, but you want to use more of the standard fonts, so that way it's easy to read for the employer. And then you should be using your text highlighting, bold, caps, all those options sparingly. And the reason for that is we don't want to overwhelm the employer. We want to make it clear and concise, but also highlight things that you really want to point out. All right, a few other things that I want to point out. There's actually 3 different types of resume styles, and I'm going to go into these today. So if you're not familiar, we'll talk about them. The first one, and often the most popular when it comes to campus recreation, is a chronological resume. This is a resume that's highlighting your employment, and you list your positions, you list the employer, and you do that in reverse chronological order. So your most current job to your oldest job. You're describing bullets with activities of what you're doing in that job, and it's usually used by people who are looking to advance within the same career field. So for example, if I'm a building manager in undergrad and I want to get a graduate assistantship, I would potentially use this type of resume because I have direct experience that is relevant. A functional resume is going to emphasize your skills and abilities rather than your job. You're going to focus on your current skills and experiences that are relevant to the role that you are interested in, rather than focusing on the employer and the job description that you had. And then this is typically used for people who are wanting to switch up careers but have transferable skills. So again, for example, if I'm working in campus recreation and I might want to go to career services, same broad scope area of experience because I both work with students. So I'm going to articulate maybe my student development experience or my human resources or communication experience rather than my campus rec job. And then there's the opportunity to do a combination of both. The reason this might become beneficial for you, especially if you're one of those grad students or professionals who takes on a lot of different responsibilities, you could use a chronological resume, but then organize it within your job in skill set categories. So for example, assessment, student development, HR, those are categories that you could help break out your bullets underneath your job responsibility. My key with doing that is that you want to focus on what the employer is looking for. So alter those categories based on the job you're applying for, if you do it that way. Okay, so we're going to talk about the resume. I'm going to show you a bunch of different examples of how to do things. Again, there's no one right way to do it, but I'm going to talk about the actual content and what should be included in your resume. And then again, if you have questions, put it in the chat. So the very first part of your resume should be your header. Included in your header is your necessary contact information, and this is typically your first impression. My recommendation is for you to get creative in this area because this is the one and only spot that you can pretty much do that, especially as it comes to your name. So use a different font than the Times or Arial. Maybe capitalize it or all lowercase. However you want to do it, just make sure you have logic behind your reasoning of what you're doing. Some people ask, should I use color? In my opinion, I would say no. And I know Troy yesterday talked about not using a picture. I would agree with that. Do not put your picture on there, but this is your area where you can be creative. It is usually located at the top of the page and it includes your name, your address and your phone number, your email, a web address potentially, and any other means of contact. Two questions I often get asked. One, should I use a temporary address or a permanent address? Again, I'm going to put that back on you and say it's up to you. Typically speaking, the reason this matters is if an employer was going to fly you in for an on-campus interview, they might want to know where you're physically located so they can budget accordingly for that. Or if they need to send you documents, they might want to have the address that is going to get you the documents that you need. That being said, some of you are going to be transitioning locations because of graduation. And so then in that case, I would recommend that you use an address that is going to be the most permanent. So maybe your parents' address. If not, it's okay to change addresses. You would just want to contact the employer during the interview process if it's still happening at that time. Email, I also recommend that you move away from your school email and create a professional email account, whether that be with Yahoo or Google. That way you can separate it from your academic materials, but also keep it consistent as you move on in your career and you don't have to continue to change your means of communication. So again, you can see at the bottom of the page, my example of my header. So you see my name and then you'll see my contact information. Next, what you can see on a resume is an objective statement. So an objective statement will answer the following questions: the position you're applying for, how you're qualified, what are your career goals, and what is your professional identity. The key to this is that you have to tailor it, and you can't just say a generic statement. It needs to be tailored to the institution or the employer that you're working for. Each employer is unique and you are unique as a person, and so you need to alter it depending on the location. And again, you're aiming for a custom fit when possible. Sometimes this isn't realistic if you're at a conference and you're physically handing out your resume to alter it to every individual, and that's where you would have a more of a generic one. So you can see an example here: to obtain the hospitality coordinator position with ABC Company, utilizing my strong communication skills and knowledge of successful customer service practices. It's tailored. Realistically, ABC Company is an actual company, not just a generic company. And it talks about their communication skills and knowledge of customer service. So one of the questions I often get asked is, do I need an objective statement? What do you think? Yes or no? Maybe. Jeffrey saying maybe. Any other thoughts? Adrian saying no.
Fine, but I think it may be important.
Ross, may be important. So this is again where I'm going to put it back to you. It's totally up to you. It's your choice. Thanks, Jen. You got it. So it's your choice if you want to include that or not. My comment is that if you do, it just needs to be tailored to the place that you are applying. So not necessarily. Okay, next section is education. Typically speaking, you will see the education as the next piece on your resume. Some people have put it at the bottom of their resume. I recommend putting it at the top because you worked hard for it, and a lot of employers, that is their first cutoff point, is whether or not you have your bachelor's or master's degree. So you will list your college or university and the degrees that were completed from there. You will start with your most recent degree. So if you're in a master's program, you'll have your master's followed by your bachelor's. You will list the degree, the major, the month, and the year you graduated. And you also need to provide the name of the university, the city, and the state. The reason you need to add the city and the state is not everybody knows where all these universities are. And so it's helpful to add to that. So an example I like to give is the University of Miami. There's the University of Miami in Florida, and then there's the University of Miami in Ohio. Those are the two different universities, completely different in the way they function, or not necessarily function, but their reputation and the image that they hold, but they're still the University of Miami. So that's where you would add the city and the state. And then you would include GPA if it's a 3.0 or better. That's a general rule of thumb. What I will say though is it's again up to you if you want to include your GPA. As somebody who's no longer in school and I've been out of school for quite a while, I no longer have it on my resume because I don't think that's the reason they're going to hire me or not. However, if you're an undergrad looking for grad work, they need to know your GPA because they need to know whether or not they're going to be able to get you into grad school. So that's an example of where you would want to include it. You can also add subheadings where you talk about your relevant coursework that might, again, help justify why you're valuable for that particular position, honors or awards, and then any accomplishments that you had. And one thing I will note is you can also include those later in your resume. So there's really, again, this autonomy for you to decide what you want to do as it relates to your education. Do not include your high school information. You're in college now. We don't need to see your high school information. So I would strongly encourage you to take that off. Unless you were like a first year freshman in undergrad, you might not have enough college experience yet. So that's where it might still be applicable to be on there if you are applying for a position on campus, for example. So here's two examples. You'll see Nick, he has a Bachelor's of Science, Sport and Rec Management. Key thing there is he actually spelled out the entire major. So I would encourage you to look at your degree audit if you're not sure what your official title is, but you should spell it out so that way it's clear what you're actually getting. The University of Iowa, Iowa City, Iowa, he added his concentration in business studies, and then he listed his GPA as well as his Dean List options. You will see for mine, I have my Master's of Education, and then I have my Bachelor's of Science. The one thing I do want to point out is my minor is listed below the university, and that's the only time you'll really specify like minor versus degree. Some of you may be wondering, why is the degree listed first instead of the university? So my personal opinion, again, this is my opinion, you could take it or leave it. I believe that the degree is more important than where you got it from, because the degree is actually what is going to get you the job, or not necessarily where you got it from. However, you could argue with me and actually flip the order and put your university first, your degree second. Whatever you do, I just ask that you be consistent across your education, so that way there's a theme in what you're doing. Okay, one of the questions I often get asked too is, what if I went to an institution but did not receive a degree from that institution? Should you include it or not? So let's say you attended a university and you got a couple credits, or you studied abroad and you went to a university and you completed one course there. What do you think? Should you include it or not?
My guess is no.
No? Well, how come, Emily? I'm going to put you on the spot.
I think to your point about the, the priority being the degree that you completed rather than the school. If I did not, I don't know. If I didn't complete or get any certifications or degree in something, I don't know if it's necessarily viewed as an impactful thing to put on your resume. I'm not sure.
Okay. I see Courtney said, I think it depends.
Yeah, I think it depends. Like, if I only did a couple credits, I personally probably wouldn't list it unless it was really applicable. However, if it was, for example, I did an exchange where I did 6 months over in Europe, I may not list that as a full university, but maybe have it listed under my degree saying I did an exchange, because I think that to employers could show certain characteristics that they may be looking for, that, the ability to pick up and move across the world, like that's huge. So I think it really depends on maybe how much you've accomplished and what the actual situation is.
Yes, I personally would agree with that, Courtney. I think studying abroad is really unique and helps set you apart. And so including an institution from another part of the world would really help you stand out. Another reason that you might want to include the degree or the institution if you only got a few credits is, let's say you want to build that connection with the employer. So for example, I went to the University of Minnesota for 1 semester. It wasn't for me, no offense, Cody, but I transferred after 1 semester. However, if I was applying back to the University of Minnesota for a job, I might want to include that I did go there for a credit or 2. So that way they know there's a connection. I understand the institution and the area that I am hoping to come back to. So there's an example of where you may want to include it. Jen, I want to call you out. You've made a couple comments. Do you want to expand on those?
So it could be a life circumstance reason that you didn't finish. As long as you're willing to share the reason for not finishing, I think you could probably include it. As long as it's not a negative thing like I failed out, people might be interested in seeing what other things you've learned.
Yes, I would agree with that. Thanks, Jen. Let's see. Yep, so we talked about that. Okay, let's go into your actual experience, your meat and potatoes. I'm gonna first focus on the chronological resume, and then we'll switch over and focus on the functional resume. So that way you can see the different options. So as it relates to experience, you need to highlight the company or the organization that you're working for and the location. Again, you need to include the city and the state, so that way they know where this is taking place. You need to include your position title. You should include the dates of employment, so your month and the years, and then a description of your responsibilities, duties, achievements, etc. At a minimum, we recommend that you have at least 2 bullets for each job section or description. So depending on where you're at with your number of roles that you've been a part of, the top position should have more bullets, and the further away you get from the most recent position, you should have less bullets. Let's talk about bullets. They're really hard to write. So you should start with a power verb to start the description. The one thing I want to point out with your power verb is you need to match the tense of what you're currently doing or not currently doing. So, and I'll get into that in a minute. You should also try and answer the questions who, what, where, when, why, and how. I will say firsthand experience, it is very hard to answer all of these questions in a sentence without it becoming obnoxious. So use your professional judgment and ask yourself, is this too much, or should I tailor it back a little bit so that way it's not overwhelming for the reader? And then quantify, quantify, quantify. I can't stress that enough. Anytime you can add numbers to help validate or improve the bullet, I would highly recommend doing that. So here's a cheat sheet of power verbs, and don't you worry, I will send you a link to access this. Oftentimes you will see a lot of repetitive power verbs in people's bullets. So for example, they'll say organized, 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 supervised, 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 performed, and it's very repetitive and there's not a lot of variety. So I'm going to share with you this list so that way you can diversify your bullets and use these verbs to help make your resume more unique and not so repetitive. So I want to give you some examples of a bullet. Here's the first example. Coordinated the supervision of facility attendants, member service attendants, and facility supervisors. Pretty good. We're answering the questions. What are they doing? Who are they doing it for? Why are they doing it? Well, that's kind of implied, right? Because they're having to supervise this, the supervision. Where are they doing it? Not really sure. I would imagine I'd be able to get that with their job description. How are they doing it? Not necessarily sure here either. So if we maybe add to it, so coordinate the supervision, training, scheduling, hiring, and evaluating of 25 facility attendants, 25 member service attendants, 18 facility supervisors, and 2 program assistants. Can you see how the bullet just became a little bit more beefier and a little bit more enticing to the employer? Because I now know how many people you're supervising, and I know how you're supervising through training, through scheduling, through hiring, through evaluating. So when you look at your current resume, I want you to ask yourself those questions. Am I truly telling the story of what I'm doing, or am I selling myself short? And again, quantify when you can, because you can see in this example, numbers made it that much better. Okay, so again, here's 2 examples of experience. You can see mine on the left-hand side. I have my employer, recreational services at the University of Iowa, Iowa City, Iowa. And then I have my most recent job, assistant director of student and member engagement. I'm also a group fitness instructor. Prior to that, though, I was a facility operations coordinator, all within the University of Iowa. So here's an example of, for those of you who have worked in more than one role within your employer, you can just leave one header at the top with the employer and then add your job descriptions below. On the flip side, if you look at Nick's, you can see that he chose to highlight his job titles first and then the employer second. So he's got recreation intern, City of Eden Prairie, Minnesota, facility supervisor, University of Iowa, recreational services. So again, there's no one right way to do this. It's all personal preference. Again, as long as you are consistent is the key with your resume. So on the flip side, if we're talking about the functional resume where we're focusing on skills and abilities, again, we're going to focus on skill categories rather than the job. So if you look on the example on the right-hand side of the screen, they're focusing on counseling and assessment, budget management, marketing, and communication. They still include their employment experiences. It's just the bullets are not under the job. They're under the skill and ability instead. And so you're listing the activities that provide evidence for each of those skills and abilities. And then again, you're going to quantify and you're going to have at least 2 bullets for each skill or ability. So that's another example. Again, you could do a merged example of doing both if you wanted to. All right, questions about that section, your meat and potatoes, because I know that can be a lot, especially as it relates to the bullets. So any questions before I move on? All right, hearing and seeing none, I will move on, but feel free to put it in the chat or yell at me later in this presentation. So the next part of your resume is the other section. And I say other broadly because it could be literally whatever you want to include to add value, keyword, add value to your resume. So activities, honors. If you see here, this is an example of my resume. So I chose to highlight my professional involvement as well as my conferences and presentations because I've been actively involved in those. And so that is how I chose to highlight. But again, there's no one right way to do this. So areas that you might include: extracurricular activities, awards, grants, prizes, special honors, memberships in professional clubs and organizations, volunteer activities, computer skills, language skills. I know Jen earlier said your certifications, so your additional trainings or certifications you might want to include. So those are all options. There's no one right way to do this. The key is that as long as you're consistent with the way you format and the way you display this information, put it on there. So again, you'll see Nick's example is on the right-hand side. He chose to highlight his professional development. He also chose to highlight his certifications as an aquatic professional. And then he really wanted to highlight his software and social media skills. One thing I will say as an employer who has gone through job searches, the key for this section in particular as it relates to like software and communication, you need to look at the job requirements. If the job requirement says that you need to have Microsoft Office and you need to have Inasoft Fusion experience, you need to explicitly state it on your resume. Otherwise, it's going to count against you and you may not get an interview. So be very intentional about what is being asked on the job and make sure that's included on your resume and explicitly stated. Even though it might be implied, you need to explicitly state it. Especially when it comes to Microsoft Office, that's the one that a lot of people choose to leave off because it's pretty intuitive that we are using Microsoft to create a resume, but sometimes employers are that picky that if it's not there, they'll dock you for that. The other thing I want to highlight is these areas are fluctuable. I don't know if that's the right word. You can move them wherever you want. So if you want to highlight your language skills at the top of your resume, go for it. If you want to highlight your certifications at the top of your resume, go for it. It's totally up to you. I just want you to have justification as to why you're doing that. Okay, questions. For sure include recreational software. Yes, Courtney, all of it, include it because people want to know. Especially nowadays, they want to know if you've done RECtrac or CSI or Fusion. I would highly recommend you include that. Cody, what are you saying? Thanks, Cody. Any questions about the resume?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is it recommended to have like a summary of qualifications before your education? From what I started my resume when I was an undergrad, and now that I'm a graduate assistant, I've just kind of revamped that based on things that I've added and things that I've changed, but they always recommended having like a summary of qualifications for whatever job that you were applying for or whatever position you're applying for as like the very first thing. So like if you don't meet these 5 check marks, then you're out kind of thing, just to get it started. Mm-hmm. Do you recommend that or?
That's a great question. I would put it back on you, Adrian. Does it add value to your resume by having that? If you think it does, then great, include it in there. If you don't, take it off. Personally, I have not ever done that, but that's partly because I think that in my resume, I've articulated my skills and abilities clearly throughout the resume that I don't need that extra section personally. But if you think you should have it or you want it, then I would say include it.
Okay. I did have one other quick question. I also, like, my resume is like a full 2 pages. Is that too long, or is that going to be, and I always was told if it's more than like front and back of a page, it's going to be too much. So is that too much, or should I keep it as it is?
Great question. And I see Courtney also put that in the chat. I think it depends on, again, going back to that question, is the content on your resume valuable? If it's not, then you should take it off. If you're missing something, then you should add it on. What I recommend though, is if you're like a paragraph on the top of the second page or on the 3rd page, then maybe let's try reformatting so that way we can get it down to 2 pages. So it's like a clean 2 pages. But you all, if you haven't already heard, rec professional resumes are very long. and they get longer the more experience that you get. So for example, mine I think is currently 4 pages, but I've also been in the field for 10 years. So I have a lot of experience that I want to highlight. As an undergrad and a grad student, I would say between 2 and 3 pages is probably acceptable. But if we go back to that main question, is there value in what's on your resume? And if it's not, then take it off.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, looks like Cody's right at 3. Yep, Courtney, it depends on how long you've been working in the field. And Jen. We still receive paper resumes. When submitting by paper, should it be 2 pages one-sided or 1 page double-sided? Great question. In my opinion, it should be 1 page or 2 pages one-sided. So you should not print them back to back, but separate pages. And then you should print them on resume paper if you have that available, because it just sets you apart a little bit more. There's also different colors of resume paper. Don't go too crazy on that, but you can diversify it a little bit and add like a slightly off-white color if you want. Okay, I'm going to jump to the cover letters just to make sure we have enough time, but I also am happy to go back and answer more questions. Okay, so cover letters. These are hard to write. I will be the first to admit I hate writing cover letters. But what you should include in your cover letter is your contact information on top. You'll see here in my example, I chose to actually match the same header that I have in my resume because I like that consistent branding across my documents. You totally don't have to do this. You could do the traditional format where you have just your contact information on the far left side. Again, all I'm asking is that you be consistent with what you do and you have justification as to why you do it. Then you should include the date of when you're sending this and the university that you're applying to, and then the contact information. One of my biggest recommendations is to figure out who this is actually going to and address the letter directly to them. Sometimes it's very clear on the job application, sometimes it's not. And so in that case, you may need to contact the HR department to figure out who is going to be reviewing those. It's just one additional step that's going to set you apart from your competitors rather than saying, dear search committee, for example. The very first paragraph, your intro paragraph, should be a highlighting paragraph. 2 to 3 sentences at most. You should talk about where you found this job and why you may or may not be qualified for it. If you have a connection, let's say Cody reached out to me and said, hey, Mallory, you should apply for this job. You should say that. So after being contacted by Cody Mickle to apply to the University of Minnesota, I decided to go for it. That's a terrible sentence, but you get the idea of why you should include that, because somebody took the initiative to reach out to you. And so therefore, as a reviewer or an employer, I would say, oh, wow, Cody thought I would be good for this position. So, or this individual would be good for this position. So I should take another look. Your middle section is your experience section. And this is sometimes repetitive to your resume, but I will say firsthand, there's 2 types of people who review your documents. One group looks at resumes, one group looks at cover letters. So you kind of have to be repetitive because you don't know who is going to actually be looking at your content. In your experience section, you need to highlight why you are directly qualified for the position you're applying to. And this needs to be tailored to that position. It can't be generic. So I know Troy talked about this yesterday, but you need to take the time to alter it for the position you're applying for. Oftentimes you'll see a cover letter work in 2 formats. One, it'll start talking about your most current experience and going to your oldest experience, or you'll see the opposite where you'll talk about how you began in the field and how you ended up to where you currently are. There's no one right way to do that. It's totally up to you and your personal preference, but you want to highlight again why you're directly qualified for the position and how your previous experience is going to make you successful in that role. You'll see on my example, I chose to highlight my current role, my previous experience, and then my NERSA experience because I wanted to really separate those out. You could lump that all into one giant paragraph. You could talk about none of your NERSA experience. It really depends on the position you're applying for and what they are looking for. And then your last paragraph is why you're going to reiterate why you're interested in the position and state how they can get a hold of you. I know this is already on there in your contact information in the top as well as your resume, but you want to include that again. And then my recommendation is for you to actually sign your resume or your cover letter, excuse me. If you have not already figured out how to do this electronically, let me know and I can help. But basically, save your signature as a PDF and insert it in your cover letter. It saves you time, and then you don't have to print it off, sign it, scan it back in, and it's kind of out of format. It's really consistent and easy to do. So I would highly recommend that you physically sign it, even if it's electronically on your cover letter. Okay, questions about cover letter? Let's see questions in the chat. Or statements, I guess.
There's one question specifically for cover letters. Would you normally address it to search committee chair?
That's a great question. And I might turn it over to other professionals in this room because I know there's a couple of you in here to see what your thoughts are. Personally, I address it to the hiring manager. So the person at the end of the day who's going to be the one making the hiring decision. A lot of times, or I shouldn't say a lot of times, at the University of Iowa, we have a committee chair who is going to oversee the search, but is not going to make the ultimate hiring decision. And so I like to address it to the person who's making the hiring decision. But I don't know if Cody or Jen or anyone else has other thoughts about that.
I would say try to find out who the person is. Or sometimes in the job description, it'll say who to address it to, actually. So use those. I know I've received resumes before that says, hello, sir. It's clear in my email that it says she, her, hers. So that one would go right to the bottom of the pile. So be very specific with titles that you're putting on. If you can use the person's first and last name, do that. That would just be my advice.
Yeah, Cody also said, also not to whom it may concern. Jen, I'm going to jump back to your question. I noticed that there are things listed in the resume, but not in the cover letter. Do I poke them for more information or ask them why? Do you mean that in the cover letter or in the interview or prior?
Yeah, if I notice, so sometimes somebody will have a really, really great resume and I'm like, wow, this is fantastic. And then I go back to the cover letter and I'm like, why did they not touch on this? Because most people read the cover letter and then if they want more, they'll go to the resume. I do it reverse. I'll look at the resume and then read the cover letter. And sometimes they don't match up, but the qualifications are there. So I might bring that person in, just say, it's not an interview, but can we chat about why you didn't include this or why you felt it wasn't important? To give them that chance. Because sometimes they're like, I never thought about that. Just going back to the previous session, those transferable skills and like mentioning those words, like, why didn't you do that? They're just like, I forgot. I had one person actually come out and say like, I ran out of time. I forgot a cover letter. So I just wrote this right now. Yeah, do you poke them for that information or where would you put that resume and cover letter?
Well, Jen, I mean, I'm also like you where I honestly don't read the cover letters. I just go right to the resume because I like to see things in that order. That's the way my brain operates. So in my opinion, as long as they have the information listed on either their cover letter or resume, and if they're qualified, I would interview them. But that being said, usually the cover letter to me is more of a summary, and so you can't touch on everything. And so in the interview, I would actually ask them, similar to why they chose to highlight those things as it relates to the job they're applying for.
I agree. I think when it comes to the cover letter, it's a space issue for a lot of people. Where I do the same, I look at the resume first because I can get more detailed on it. And for certain things that a job description may be asking, maybe I didn't do it in my current role, but I did it in my previous role. But maybe I want to elaborate more on my current role because it's more applicable in terms of time. So I think it really just depends, but I think you can totally ask them why they didn't touch on it. But I do know for cover letters, it's definitely a space issue, because recruiters will tell you all the time, like, don't go past this long. It's only really supposed to be like, you know, couple sentences per paragraph and move on, because that's what your resume is for. But again, I think it depends on the job and the field that you're applying within.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with that, Courtney. Thank you. Any other questions about the cover letter or comments? I appreciate Cody's comment about asking others for help. If you don't get your applications material reviewed by someone else, then you are failing. It's true. Please have somebody else look at your stuff and cross-reference with the job you're applying for, because they might pick up on things that you should also highlight or include that you're missing. You know, when you look over your materials over and over again, sometimes it can be a blur. So encourage someone else to look at it. All right, I'm
It
gonna
also
move.
be,
Oh, go ahead.
Mallory, if I can jump in, recognizing what we're talking about with cover letters and resumes. Maybe if you, so you have no control over who's reading your materials and how they're going to consume and interpret and whatever your resume and cover letter. So recognizing that we have heard outright here, there are some professionals on some hiring committees that will only look at your cover letter and maybe not get past that. Maybe try to like give them some breadcrumbs to lead them to your resume, you know, like reference your resume in a line in your cover letter. I have a lot more experiences on my resume, but I'm going to discuss this one a little bit more in depth, or I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about this one in my cover letter. Please, you know, see my other experiences in my resume or whatever, maybe to try to get them there. Whatever works for you.
I think that is a great recommendation, Kogi. Dangle the fruit so that way they're enticed to read more. I'm gonna get to that question at the end because I want to make sure we get through references, and then we'll circle back. So I see your question about interviews. We'll come back. So the last section I want to talk about is references, and you can see this is my old reference page based on my maiden name. But on your references, you should list, it should be a separate sheet. You shouldn't automatically provide your references unless they ask for it. And my recommendation for this is once you hand over your references, you are basically giving them the autonomy to call them and ask for further information. And you want to take control of that. You want to be in control of that process. And so I don't recommend that you provide it unless it's being asked. The other thing I highly, highly recommend is you need to get the okay for them to be your reference. Troy asked or talked about yesterday about your reputation and holding on to that and grasping to that. As an employee and a professional in this field, my reputation and the references I choose to give out are just as important as the work I'm doing, because I'm speaking on behalf of that person, but I'm also saying like, yeah, as a professional, I think they're great or not. And so what I recommend is that you ask them. I have gotten phone calls before for reference checks, and I've straight up said, I will not give a reference for them because they did not ask. And so I strongly encourage you to ask the individuals who you are hoping would be your references. And I would recommend that you ask them to be a positive reference because there have been negative references done before. You should include their name, address, phone number, and email. You should verify what information they actually want you to use. So whether it's a personal phone number or a personal email versus professional. Do not include or do include supervisors, instructors, coworkers. As a professional, I like to include student employees who can speak on behalf of how I was as a supervisor, but then also supervisors. Don't include your relatives, friends, or neighbors. Those individuals, not the appropriate time to include them on your reference list. Lots of stuff happening in the chat. Let me see if I can catch up.
I was just saying, as someone who has had students reach out or, you know, other coworkers to be their reference, when you're not told and you randomly get a phone call or they've given out my personal cell phone, it actually irks me to my very core because I'm ill prepared, or, you know, maybe I'm out walking the dog and I'm completely caught off guard. So definitely make sure you ask and let them know or when you ask them like, how would you prefer them to contact you, whether it's email, office phone, or cell phone. So at least that way they know and can even have notes or whatever that maybe you should be expecting that call.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also recommend that you send your most updated resume to them so they can highlight some of the things that you have done, especially if it's been a while since they've worked for you. And those who are graduate assistants, this is going to be happening to you sooner than later if you haven't already experienced it, where your student employees are going to start asking you to be references. So keep that in mind as you are getting those requests. Courtney, are you going to add something else?
Yeah, and Jen, you can probably correct me because I'm probably wrong on this, but I feel like I was told at one point in Canada anyways, that if you're going to be a reference for someone and it's not a positive reference, you actually cannot really give a reference. You just basically have to say like, I prefer, like, I decline the option to be a reference for this person. I feel, Jen, am I like?
No, you're right. You're right.
Yeah, it's like a huge thing here.
You would decline to be a reference as
Yeah,
giving them a bad reference.
because it's like, what is it, defamation or something, even though it might be true. It's something weird like that. So just keep that in mind as well. For Canadian people, I don't know about the States on that one.
No, I think that's pretty accurate here as well. Yeah, I would echo that. Cody also mentioned in the chat to send them the link to the posting that you are applying for. I would agree, this is extremely helpful to know the position and what they're looking for. So then again, as a reference, I can tailor my response based on what they're looking for and your experience with me. Wow, there's a lot coming through here. I'm not able to keep up. What about your thoughts about asking a student that you supervise to be a reference? Jeffrey, can you expand upon that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, definitely. I think my thought with that is that, you know, if it's a student that, you know, I'm a current graduate assistant. So if it's a student that I've supervised for 2 years, you know, asking them to be a reference as somebody who's worked under me and can kind of, you know, attest to leadership abilities or how I connect with students, stuff like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think as long as you think they can articulate your experience as a supervisor and articulate it well, then I would highly recommend including that.
Cool. Thank you.
What is your philosophy on using peer references specifically for the campus recreation field? Graduate assistant for another graduate assistant. Ooh, good question, Emily. That's a good question. My personal recommendation is to not do it. I would recommend to use somebody who has supervised you or worked for you. And my logic for that is it's like direct experience. Not that you could work on that project with them. I guess it depends on what you're applying for. I'm kind of going in circles here, but that would not be my first choice of a recommendation for a reference. I don't know, others have thoughts?
I think it just depends on what kind of references they're asking for. I've had it where I've had like jobs ask me for personal and professional, so maybe use it as your personal because they can see you in both areas. So I think it just really depends.
Good point, Courtney. All right, I am gonna go ahead. We talked about most of this. Yep, we talked about all of that, so I'm gonna skip to that. So the last part is going to the press. Make sure you spell check all of your documents, proofread them 3 times, have somebody else look at it. We want the content to be error-free, spelling, no grammars, no typos. You should have a visual impact. So I didn't really touch on this much, but oftentimes there's a lot of white space. And so thinking about spreading your content out to the edges of the pages, the bolding choices, your bullets. If you noticed on my resume, I actually chose to use diamonds as my bullets because I wanted to be a little bit unique in that sense. So again, logic behind everything you're doing. Select, what am I writing? Select quality resume paper. Yep, select quality resume paper. I don't know why there's a comma there, but using resume paper if possible. And then if you're sending it through email, use a PDF. So that way the formatting doesn't change if you're on a Mac versus a Word, etc. Questions? I'm gonna jump back to the question about interviews. How would you go about asking about getting feedback following an interview? Also, is it okay to reach out to HR to overlook your personal file after to look over your personal file after an interview? It's a great question. There's a lot of ways you could do this. I've actually had people directly call me as the search chair and say, can you provide me feedback about my interview experience, my application materials, and why or why not I was moved forward. And I'm happy to provide that feedback because that means you're taking the initiative to improve for the next step. And so I can't speak for every campus rec professional, but I would say in general, our field is really on board with that. And so I would strongly encourage you to reach out. As it relates to HR, again, I can only speak to Iowa, but our HR department is also very transparent and open in providing feedback as to why or why not you were moved forward in the process. And so I think at any point you get eliminated, I hate to say that, but you get eliminated from the process. At that point is your opportunity to reach out and ask for feedback. If you ask for it before you even know you got the next round of an interview, then that's kind of not going to necessarily benefit you because you don't know whether or not it's impacting you at that time. Cody, talk out loud. You're typing a lot of things.
Just trying to encourage people to be kind to themselves, that you know, it's not always because you're a terrible human being or something. Like if you get an on-campus interview or if you get to the final round, you should take that as an enormous compliment, because man, I mean, oftentimes we shut off searches when we get too much into triple digits because it takes a lot of time and you kind of wear out your hiring committee for the next search if you have too much time looking at so many applications and materials and stuff. So it's more so about the math of how difficult it is to get a position as opposed to I'm terrible. And I think as an individual, it's easy to sort of dwell or focus on those things sometimes, and to try to just trust that the universe is working out something to your benefit and on to the next opportunity.
Thanks, Cody. Thanks for being positive. Courtney, I see a couple questions. So what if you have gaps in your work experience? That is a great question and also realistic. And so I would just put it on there in your resume as you see fit, the order of your experience. And then in your cover letter, you may want to touch on that gap if you want to. A lot of times though, yes, it might be a flag to an employer of, oh, there's an interesting gap here. But if I can see that you were doing something during that time, that's going to show me that, like, okay, maybe you had a personal life circumstances that drew you away from that particular field. It's not going to deter you, in my opinion. So as long as you make it clear as to what happened, well, finger happy here. I am all for displaying that gap and not trying to hide it. And then I see, how far back should you go in your years of work experience? Again, this is up to you, and is it adding value to your resume? So for me, I have listed all the way back to my undergrad employer because I want to still have the connection to that university, but I literally have 2 bullets, and I don't have all the jobs I did there anymore. I only have the very last job I did. At some point, that's probably going to come off because it's not going to be as valuable as my current work experience and what I did in grad school and my first professional job. So it's up to you, Courtney. Does it add value and does it not? And that's where, for everybody, I highly recommend that you just create like a long curriculum vitae, basically of all your experience ever, and then you pull bits and pieces off of for the specific jobs you're applying for. So that way you don't have to recreate the wheel, but you also can tailor it for the job that you are interested in. Ooh, Allie chiming in here. Sometimes rejections are people looking out for you and knowing the job wouldn't be a great fit. Ooh, I still agree with that. Although rejection is hard, it is valuable. Good learning experience. Any other questions, comments? We have like 4 minutes. Concerns, confessions. Would it be a red flag for employers if your resume shows that you move jobs every 2 to 3 years? At your particular stage, actually, I'm taking an assumption here. If you're an undergrad or grad, no, because that's expected. If it's less than a year, I would agree it is a red flag if you're doing that often. Like if you're only working at the employer for less than a year, then it is a little bit of a red flag because it shows a lack of commitment for the for the employer. But sometimes there's reasons behind that too. So that's where you can use your cover letter to help articulate that if it is a reason. Yep. So, oh, seasonal position, that's understandable. Don't worry about that. I can't speak for all the professionals in the room, but please, if you want to send me your resume, if you want to send Cody your resume, Jen, I'm going to put you out there. Courtney, maybe you too. We are happy to look over them and give you feedback. Again, I mentioned this earlier, and I know Cody did too. The more eyes that look at your materials, the better. So please send us your resumes and your cover letters. We're happy to look at that. My email is on the screen, and I see some of them are going in the chat. Ross, you have a question about LinkedIn. Do you think LinkedIn is a great place to keep all of your experiences? In my personal opinion, collegiate recreation does not care about LinkedIn. But if you are outside of collegiate recreation, yes, you should have everything on LinkedIn. But if you plan to stay in the field of collegiate recreation, I don't think LinkedIn is where you should be spending your time. Yes, you can also email Allie. She is great at looking at this stuff too. I think that's it. Cody, anything am I missing? Other professionals? All right, well, I'll hang out here if you have a question, but otherwise, have a great Friday, good weekend.